Okay, so we're going to look at style today. So when it comes to design, it doesn't matter if you're doing print design, it doesn't matter if you're doing web design, or any type of design. You can pretty much figure out where a design comes from, what was the idea behind it, but more importantly, what style has it been rendered in? And that's what we're going to sort of look at today. So in packaging design, it's no different than any other design. You really want to understand where you're going with your design. And if you don't understand the style that you want to accomplish, then there's a good chance that you never exactly get there. And the other thing too is it's great to know what style you're going to do your packaging in before you start, so you don't just stumble upon something and have mixed imagery, mixed type. So we're going to look at a few different categories, a lot of different categories. I don't know how many categories. They're not official categories, so that's the one thing I should say off the top is the styles that we look at today are typically based on sort of industry knowledge of where styles come from, where did they originate from. So that's what we're going to look at, and I'm going to take you through some, and hopefully this will stick with you guys going forward. So modern design is probably the one category that most of you can identify with. Modern clean design. All it really refers to is creating a design that is typically not overly busy, um, has good topography, clean topography. So when I say modern, it probably means that it's going to have a sans serif, lots of white space. It pretty much is the simplest design that a student can accomplish. It just means you're taking forward all of the areas that you've been taught in type design, in layout design, and you're using those principles. So again, plenty of white space. Simplicity is the key. So if we look at these milkshakes, really it's modern, fairly expressive sans serif with a secondary sans serif. It's using a little bit of pattern, not a lot. Everything is centered, but the primary thing is that it's kind of, the colors are friendly, the type is clean, there's lots of white space. So here we go, same sort of idea, sort of minimal branding at the top, followed by some vertical type, very, very basic color breaks without any illustration. So yeah, very clean and modern. Now, modern and clean design should be one of the easiest ones for students to accomplish. But as we look at these soda can designs, something has shifted a little bit. So these are no longer purely clean and modern approaches. They are clean and modern, but if you have a look here, there's a few subtle elements. So the white break along the top of the label, the numbers above the title, this sort of very tight leading at the bottom. So what's happening here is that now this design has moved from clean and modern, which it has a lot of those elements, but now it also has a little bit of Swiss design and a little bit of vintage label design. Now let's flip right back. So here we have some other soda designs, clean, lots of white space, but you'll notice that the type is very well handled. And that's the main difference between modern and clean to modern, but a little bit of industrial or vintage. Now let's wade into industrial vintage. You can't have sort of vintage without it having a nod to sort of government forms. You see that a lot in design. So this is kind of a very safe version of that. So what we're looking at here is a label that is meant to replicate a vintage label that you would see sort of in the 40s and 50s. You'd often see it on farm machinery, on government documents, really sort of industrial topography. So if we look at the relative elements that this is talking about, it's really several type changes. And it's meant to be uncomfortable. So this one happens to start with a serif up at the top, but then it moves into, you know, a very kind of heavy condensed, all caps, switches to a very normal sort of sans, and then you can start seeing that really to get that sort of label, that industrial sort of government label feeling, they have quite a few elements. So the net of the numbers down at the bottom, and look at this, now that we're moving into a system of rules, right? So this is now implementing even more sort of label vintage industrial feel to it, and which is very synonymous with having elements of rules that break up the information. So there's nothing in here that is meant to be sort of soft. It's meant to look like something that you would see sort of in the 50s and you know, 40s, 60s type thing. So this is a continuation of the same thing. What this one has added is little sections that are meant to be stamped, right? So when you see number 1 and you see that X up at the top, those are meant to be areas that you would see in old labels that would actually need a stamp on it, right? So it has that industrial feel. This one has added a little icon down at the bottom. Where this one actually fails is introducing this sort of typewriter typeface. Really, it's too generic, it's too trendy from the past. It does not have the same look and feel as if it was an actual style from sort of the 50s or 60s. That type of design is not the same as typewriter type. So this one loses a little bit there. But then as we start moving down, you can see many examples of that. So when we look at these cocktail kits, so now we're using the same elements to create a very symmetrical design, adding icons, still using a rule system. And so you will see that as we kind of scroll down, or if we go back. So now if we actually have a look at where these things came from, these are old labels, but that kind of that design is relatively where these things originated. So you'll see that on a lot of these things, they often have sort of very heavy sort of mixed type. Here's some ticket designs from the past where it's the same sort of thing. There's a lot of there's a lot of areas where things get stamped or overprinted. Um, there's a real sort of heavy typographic look to it. There's a lot of rules. Those are all sort of, you would see a lot of this type of thing. Ticket design was very much like that back in the 40s and 50s, and you will see those types of things emulated very much today. And a lot of the vintage sort of packaging that you'll see, maybe it doesn't go this far, but you will definitely see that it's influenced by this sort of design. So here's an actual government form from today, and you can see that a lot of those elements, like the type elements, still pertain, right? So that's where the sort of an industrial rule system that you see in packaging and any type of design sort of comes from. Now, if we go back and look at some of today's packaging, you can see where a lot of those elements came from. So borrowing, the sectioning, the rule systems, the multiple changes in typefaces. Having areas where you actually stamp numbers in, so it can be timestamps or dates, or your handwritten stamps as well. So you can see this one sort of has these sort of mock dates in there to make it seem like, there's like this, it's all kind of a form that needs to be filled out and boxes crossed, and you will see that in a lot of different types of design. So what ends up happening is, some design goes all in on it, and you can sort of see these examples of here, but then you start getting sort of cross-pollinated styles. And what I mean by that is, like this migrant Scotch whiskey, it's, it very much has this old sort of government feel to it. However, there's a lot of design that will sort of take that look and feel and sort of merge it with other types of styles. So, if we sort of look down here, so here we go, where we're starting now to move into sort of it's cross-pollinating different types of design. So this has a little bit of clean, sort of modern feel to it, which is very different than that label, the label vintage feel. But here we still have a little bit of the label vintage feel down at the bottom. So now we're starting to use some of those influences from vintage government label design, and we're moving it and sort of modernizing it, right? So you'll see a lot of design where it'll be influenced by that, but maybe it will cross-pollinate with another type of design. So you will see a lot of instances where you'll get design that has some of that, but not all of that. So if we look at Forager's gin, right? Yes, it absolutely has this sort of label look to it on the bottle, and it looks like an old vintage label. But then it's using kind of a little bit of modern patterning. Obviously, there's these lines in behind it. The colors are very sort of vintage label design. So we start moving and taking some of those influences and using it to do other types, to make it look a little bit different. So Woodker now takes that same look and uses imagery behind it. And you will see that very often with this sort of vintage sort of label feel, where you'll start seeing it mixed with other types of imagery, right? So here's one that actually has a photograph on the inside of the bottle, which gives it a very nice sort of modern feel. So you will see that that type of design, and then we start twisting it a little bit more, and hopefully this comes in a little bit clearer. It's very poor, very poor. So what we end up starting to move into is using that same sort of industrial feel, but then focusing on numbers. And that is a huge thing in packaging where sort of oversized numbers with smaller type becomes a thing, right? It is a design style. So as we kind of scroll through here, I'm sure we can find plenty of examples. So along with things like label design, part of that sort of visual vernacular is using numbers, right? So you will see that often as a feature in packaging, where you're sort of moving it beyond just sort of flat, where the type is all relatively the same size, to sort of using some of those elements that blow the thing up. So now you're starting to see very much it's vintage government sort of label design, but now it's starting to take numbers and feature numbers and using imagery around it as well. So you will see that quite a bit. So taking numbers as the sort of hero and then introducing, kind of a vintage feeling, vintage feel to the actual label itself, but then modernizing it with patterns, but still using numbers. So taking those numbers, taking the type, blowing it up, so really sort of introducing other elements that almost become sort of definitely a vintage feel to it, but now with some modern twists on it. So here we have some olive oil that sort of takes that feeling, and now we're sort of looking at taking numbers and we're kind of mixing styles, right? So we do have a rule system. It's a very simple rule system, but this now is sort of taking the idea of these sort of industrial numbers and it's mixing it with sort of clean, even Swiss typography where it's very sort of minimal. So at this point, it's kind of using, taking some elements from a few different areas of design. So kind of swerving back into the vintage label look, using some big colored numbers. So we start moving into this sort of categories called numbers, which started with the same idea of sort of this oversized label design. And we start taking that, the very idea of the label design and layering it over top of pattern. So that really moves us into almost its own category itself, which is pattern / label design, where you will see probably the majority, the highest percentage of design happens in packaging, where you will see patterns in the background and sort of labels that sit over top of it, to give it a little bit of industrial feel, but whatever happens with that patterning in the background softens it up, and so it moves it from purely sort of large numbers and industrial to more modern. And so you'll see that more than any other type of design, you will see that sort of happen with the sort of label sitting on top of pattern, whether that's pure pattern, abstract, or graphic. That's where packaging sort of takes off, right? So here we have Mast, very popular packaging, and now it's starting to use things like a slight nod to the industrial sort of labels on top of it. So not trying to be soft and at all sort of fuzzy. It still has a bit of an industrial feel, but now it's layering it in with geometric shapes, painted elements, and then you will see that a lot. So with their packaging for chocolate, you'll see all sorts of different types of patterns, handmade patterns, geometric, vector-based patterns, and that is a huge sort of, you will see that across the board. It is the most popular way to sort of introduce graphics. So here we sort of have this strange sort of typography that sort of using this hyphenation gives it a bit of an industrial feel. You'll see that it does have a rule system around it, so it has a bit of a vintage feel, but then it uses kind of these background patterns. And you'll see that in all sorts of different um, um, product categories. So here we sort of are moving into label design, but now we're looking at a little bit more clean and approachable on the label, and then using pure sort of illustrative patterns in the background. So patterns can fall into a lot of different categories, right? So you will see sort of illustrative, iconic ones. You see painted, abstract ones, and those often actually influence the look and feel of the actual product itself. And they can be, this packaging has a very kind of subtle monotone feel to the patterns, which then soften it a little bit, and it breaks it up into sectioning it off. So that's that. Moving from label design, one of the ways to sort of get the same effect as label design is then to knock out areas of the pattern, as opposed to making it look like it has a true label sitting down on top of it. So if you look at a few of these ones, all that's really happening here is, we're keeping the white at the top. We're ending the patterns, the geometric patterns, using a system of rules. So this is definitely, feeling like it has a little bit of everything. It's got clean, it has elements of clean and modern. Obviously pattern, the rule system sort of harkens back a little bit. So you will see that's when you'll start seeing design that sort of brings in all of these elements. So patterning definitely is one of the most popular ways to do it, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? It can be pure illustrative. It can be, like I said, it can be just actual patterns in the background. It can be handmade. So you'll see a lot of this in high-end packaging especially. And then depending on what you do with that patterning, depending on how you sort of do the type on it, it changes the look and feel of it. So you'll see plenty of examples of sort of pattern design that is modern, and plenty of that is vintage. So you can see even by having things like painted elements. So this is a very modern, beautiful approach to the pattern underneath it. And it's not necessarily a repeating pattern. That's the other thing. There's repeating patterns, or there's sort of wallpaper or more sort of textured base patterns. So, this chocolate sort of is, again, sort of bringing in many sort of elements. So, the rule system and the type is somewhat vintage, but it doesn't go all in on the vintage look and feel. So it kind of is borderline modern, but it still has a nod to that sort of vintage feel. And you'll see that quite often. That's often a way that designers can give packaging its own sort of look and feel. So if you look at Frank, it's the same sort of thing. So what they've done is bring in a little hand-rendered element to it, which sort of plays nicely with the sort of hand-rendered illustration style. But then the rest of the label has more of a vintage feel to it. There's also a lot of different ways to break up the pattern. So here we have a very traditional sort of label, but the positioning of the label sort of gives it a much different feel. So it's not perfectly centered, it's sort of lower down to let the patterns sort of stand out. very much has kind of a 1930s, 1940s feel to the type. Not heavy industrial, but a little bit more vintage. So if we take that kind of feeling of vintage lines and labeling and we push it even further and we blow up the type, you start moving into a category that's basically oversized and bold. And it can use elements from all of the different things. So it can have pattern, it can be vintage, but the overlying sort of feature of bold design is typically oversized numbers or oversized words, less sort of white space. So you'll see it's a it's a category of its own. So you'll see it in things like industrial packaging. So anytime you see sort of lighting and drills and things like that, it very much has that sort of look and feel. Bold design, you'll often find that it sort of a lot of times has things like big numbers, oversized type, but it still has to sort of balance off those elements by having areas of white space. So even though that instant lunch is kind of huge type, it's relatively laid out, so it still has a clean feel to it. So that actual bold sort of approach to packaging, sort of sometimes it can work with imagery, sometimes it can just be purely typographic as well. So using pure typography is sort of its own category, and you will see a lot of it out there. Sometimes you'll see it with colors, but with white space. Sometimes that type will take over, and sometimes that sort of typographic approach moves into other categories. So when we're talking about just pure sort of type, then you start moving into areas of type that is hand rendered, and hand rendered packaging it really is its own sort of category of design, and you will see it a lot. You will see it in type. You will see it with type and image, but the main sort of character of it is that it has this kind of loose feel to it. Sometimes it'll have a whimsical feel to it, but it is kind of it's its kind of own category. So as well as sort of using type as the main artwork. So quirky, right? So we move from pure type to quirky, sort of using quirky approaches to type, using and often when you're using quirky type and hand rendered type, it often the packaging often also has a sense of humor to it. So you can see here kind of mock-up that almost looks like it's all hand rendered, but definitely has a sense of humor to it, and then using things like color to sort of create pattern with type. So all of these things can sort of weave it in and out. So when you have sort of hand rendered type, you can sort of see it so we've talked about sort of modern, we've talked about vintage and pattern, typographic. The last sort of area that I want to look at is purely looking at sort of symmetrical design that is based around icons. And whether those icons are pure icons like we see here, or whether they're illustrative, it is very much a way to set up a packaging design. So whether that icon um, is used as more of an illustrative element, or whether it's used as purely an icon, it's definitely very popular within packaging design itself. So the idea, the idea that you sort of understand and recognize the type of styles, whether it's, sort of vintage design, or whether it's clean and modern, or whether it's Swiss typography, or whether it's iconic or illustrative. The main part is that once you kind of understand what you want to do with your design, you'll understand that all of those kind of styles have elements that need to be consistent, and they have elements that make them what they are. So whether it's the sort of bold colors and clean typography, or whether it's a hand rendered sort of feel, they all have different elements. They're all used equally in packaging design, and the main thing for students is to understand what those elements are, and then what you want to do with your packaging. Do you want it to be bold and clean, or do you want it to be kind of humorous and quirky, or hand rendered? Do you want to use sectioning? Do you want to have a cross between kind of a vintage label and then a more modern approach in the background? So there's absolutely there's all sorts of design out there, and it's important that you start understanding that when you start these projects, that they're going somewhere